Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful Monday. Today we're going to be talking about a few things you should know before breeding phantom crested geckos. The first thing you should know before breeding phantom crested geckos is a pretty obvious one, but that is how the gene actually works. It's pretty widely accepted at this point that it's a recessive gene. However, unfortunately, there is still people who don't believe it or are not correctly labeling their animals, and that means labeling phantoms as phantoms and labeling hets as hets. And so if you're an unsuspecting buyer, you may fall into this and buy an animal that you unknowingly has phantom or maybe doesn't have phantom and you thought it did. But understanding how the gene works is very important, obviously, because with a recessive gene, if you're breeding two phantoms together, you're getting all phantoms. But more importantly, if you're breeding a phantom to a non-phantom, then you're getting some hets that are carrying the gene but don't look like they're. I made a whole video on it that you can go back and watch, and I will have it linked at the end of this video. But also just understanding how it works is very important, and labeling your animals is also very important if you plan to be selling phantoms. The second thing that you should know before breeding phantoms is a common misconception that I've heard kind of spread around, and I might have even accidentally said it, but that phantoms are like a blank slate. And while this is kind of true, it is also kind of false, and let me explain. So I believe that this started because phantoms were referred to as patternless, and now we know that they're basically the same thing. They are the same thing. Phantoms are patternless, patternless are phantoms. At least that's how we understand it for the time being. But in the past, people would say phantoms or patternless are like a blank slate because you could mix them into other things and get the traits that you were trying to while not really getting any of the phantom. And we know that would obviously be pretty obvious because if you're breeding phantom to a normal, you're getting a bunch of hets without knowing it, or at least we didn't know it at the time. So they thought they were kind of creating a blank animal. A good example of this would be like breeding a lily white, a normal lily white, to a red phantom. You're going to create probably a bunch of nice red lily whites, and it looks like, oh, you got just the patternless phantom in there of the red, and you got all the good characteristics of the lily white. Little did you know, you just created a bunch of het phantom lily whites. So in that first generation, it would look like just kind of a clean slate animal, and you were just using the lily white and getting the red from the phantom. However, if you've ever bred any phantoms, you would know that this isn't true, because a good example of this and an easy one to see is if you have two phantoms that have very defined pinstripe scales, you're going to get a bunch of babies that also have very defined pinstripe scales. And like another one that I did was that I took a phantom with very defined pinstripe scales and I paired it to a normal gecko that was not really a pinstripe, but like a kind of a partial pinstripe. And a lot of the babies came out, yes, they got the nice red base, but they also got full, thick pinstriping. So keep this in mind when you're breeding your phantoms, depending on what you're going for. Some phantoms have a very defined pinstripe scaling, and this is one of the easier things to see. This is why I'm using it as an example. Some will have a very defined pinstripe scaling, and you'll get that oftentimes passed down into the offspring. Or some of them are going to have more of that like furry back where they don't have the nice pinstripe scales, which can be good or bad depending on what you're going for. So to kind of sum up what I just said, keep this in mind when you're breeding your phantoms. If you're breeding two 100% hets together, are both carrying the phantom gene, you're going to get combinations of both of the parents in those phantoms. Even though they're going to look patternless, below the surface there is going to be some of those traits. And the most easy one that I find to see is like pinstriping. You can see if they have that nice thick pinstriping if both of the parents did, or maybe both of the parents didn't, and it'll be more just kind of that furry look. So even though phantoms are patternless and kind of look like a blank slate, below the surface there are things at play there that are going to affect them slightly on the outside, but could potentially really affect the offspring depending on what your pairings look like. And I think that's something that's very important when considering your pairs. The third thing to keep in mind when breeding phantoms is that a lot of them don't fully bloom until they're about 15 grams. Now, phantoms are kind of interesting because unlike some of the other gecko morphs, think of lily whites, extreme harlequins, anything that has a lot of pattern, those are often born with a lot of pattern and it continues to progress as they get older. Unfortunately, with phantoms, since they're basically patternless, there is no pattern to see, and so let's say you breed two red phantoms together, and you're new to this and you didn't know this, you're going to get a bunch of like brown, kind of tan colored babies. And you might be thinking that, that's what you get and they're going to stay like that, and that is way wrong. Most of the time when you breed two red phantoms together and you get those tan babies, you need to give them to about 15 grams before the color really starts to come in. And there is kind of a larger range there. I would say like 10 to 25 grams is when color really develops. At about 25 grams, they're probably going to be their brightest if we're talking about kind of red or red-orange phantoms. If we're talking about dark phantoms, they usually start out a little bit lighter and get darker, again in that same kind of range. I haven't really done too much with like orangish or yellowish phantoms, so I couldn't really speak to that. But especially with red phantoms, I see this all the time. People on MorphMarket posting up like these 5-gram little red phantoms that are just kind of brown in color. And a lot of those can turn into really, really nice red animals. You just got to give them some time. And like I said, 15 grams really seems to be the range. By 25 grams, they're going to be at their brightest. And then they usually dull out a little bit, honestly, from there. But just keep that in mind if you're breeding phantoms. If you're working with white spot phantoms, like the reds that have the white spots, the white spots usually start small when they are born, and they get a little bit bigger and bigger and bigger, and maybe around 15 grams they're just still there. But I've noticed with mine that closer to adulthood is when they really get big. On my last batch of red and white spot phantoms, by the time they were adult size, they really blossomed and got the white spots. But before then, like even below 30 grams, they didn't have them as much. So maybe keep that in mind too if you're working with the white spot phantoms. My fourth and final thing to keep in mind before breeding phantoms is that breeding phantoms is kind of boring in a way. And I'm not talking about doing a bunch of different things like phantom hets or phantom lily whites, but just breeding phantoms, phantom to phantom, is really boring. And that can be good or bad. But if you're just breeding 2 red phantoms together, I think you're going to be disappointed. Just because if you're not working with any of the other traits that go along with phantom, it is unfortunately really boring, because you could breed 2 red phantoms together. You're going to get a bunch of geckos that are patternless and brown, and they might be like that for months until they hit 15 grams. So you could have a bunch of patternless brown geckos with no pattern, nothing to tell if they're developing any better or not, until like a couple months in and they're like 15 grams. So if you're just doing that, just keep in mind it might be really boring. I personally love phantoms. I'm not hating on them. I think they're great. But if you're just working on plain phantoms, it is boring. So you got to have some other things. You might want to work on phantom lily whites and, trying to create some nice hets and things like that to keep yourself occupied, because phantoms on their own are really boring. Unlike something like lily whites, for example, where you breed one, you hatch it, and then every week that you check on it from there on out, it's going to get a little bit more pattern, maybe a little bit more color, and just really develop, and you can watch it develop in a nice way. Phantoms just are brown, 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 brown. Oh, maybe it's a little bit red, and then finally it gets red. But that's a long process to wait, so just keep that in mind too if you're thinking about breeding only phantoms. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I appreciate you watching it. Let me know down below in the comments if there's anything else you'd like to add about phantom crested geckos. And with all that being said, I hope to see you in my next video.